On November 9, 1971, John List murdered his wife Helen, aged 46, his daughter, Patricia, aged 16, and his sons Frederick, aged 13, and John Jr., aged 15, and his own mother Alma, aged 84, using his own 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun. John List was a devout Lutheran and a Sunday school teacher, and in 1943, he enlisted in the United States Army as a lab technician during World War II. John List eventually went on to earn his bachelor's degree in business administration and his master's degree in accounting. In November of 1950, he was stationed at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where he met the woman who would soon become his wife, Helen Morris Taylor. In 1952, John List moved on to be an audit supervisor at a paper company. Soon his 3 children were born. Helen became depressed and turned to alcohol to the point that she became increasingly unstable. In 1965, John decided to move with his wife, children, and mother into Breeze Knoll, a 19-room Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield in New Jersey City, New Jersey, after accepting a job as vice president and controller at a bank. At first, John did great at his new job at the bank, however, that did not last. His work ethic started to decline. John's wife Helen's depression only worsened. She suffered from severe headaches and stayed in bed most of the day, and stopped cleaning. Helen would torture John while he was at work by calling him repeatedly throughout the day, calling him a bad father and telling him to come home and change the baby. John did his best to make Helen happy and was originally a good father and husband. However, Helen declined rapidly. Before Helen had met John, she had contacted syphilis from her ex-husband and never told anyone, not even John. The syphilis began to affect her brain and cause internal bleeding and dementia. Helen began to suffer blackouts and fell and hit her head, cracking her skull. While she was being hospitalized, the doctors claimed they could not tell whether she was hysteric or psychotic. The kids started to do poorly in school and their grades started declining. The boys began skipping school and Patricia began doing drugs. John's performance at the bank was not good enough and he eventually was fired. He did not tell anyone in the family and would still get up every day and say he was leaving for work, eventually finding another job. By 1968, Helen's condition was rapidly declining. She would lay in a dirty bed that had been unwashed for months. Her hair was unkempt and unwashed bruises covered her body from her constant falling. Doctors had come to the conclusion that Helen had an organic brain disease and cerebral atrophy, which is a result of untreated syphilis. John did his best to keep the family afloat. He wasn't making enough money where he was working. He decided to take out 2 new mortgages on the house and managed to earn $1,000 a month, which was just enough to stay afloat. Unfortunately, his earnings had dropped. The children started to wear old and ripped clothing, and John and the family became extremely poor. John started borrowing money from his mother Alma, but would instead stay home studying the Bible. He soon became infatuated with the Bible, constantly studying each word and phrase. John's daughter Patricia had decided that she wanted to be an actress and joined a drama group, which he was strongly against. Patricia started to take an interest in witchcraft and started spending time with a 21-year-old man. John was at his breaking point. His kids were turning into what he had dreaded, and he claimed that they were headed toward eternal damnation. His wife Helen's mental state was worsening day by day, and she was dying a slow, painful death. In September, the bank started the foreclosure proceedings for the home. John felt as though he had failed as a husband and father. He contemplated his options and decided that he could either abandon his family, kill himself, divorce Helen, or kill his mother and Helen. In September, the bank started the foreclosure proceedings for the home. On October 14th, John went and got his gun permit. He did not buy any guns as he already had 2 at home, however, he did buy ammunition. John decided to kill his family so that they could go to heaven and not suffer living off of welfare. He thought of killing himself as well but claimed he would go to hell. He believed that even though murder was a sin, he could at least be forgiven. On November 9, 1971, the kids went off to school like any other typical day. John then loaded his 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun and his Colt .22 caliber revolver, walked into the kitchen and shot Helen in the back of the head while she was sipping her morning coffee. He then went to his mother's bedroom and shot her above her left eye while she lay in bed. As his daughter Patricia, 16, and younger son Frederick, 13, arrived home from school, John snuck up behind them and shot each of them in the back of the head. John then made himself lunch and then drove to his bank to close both his and his mother's bank accounts. He then went to watch his elder son John Jr. play in a soccer game. He then took John Jr. home and shot him repeatedly. John Jr. had attempted to defend himself and had many defensive wounds. The gun had apparently misfired a few times during the altercation. John then placed the bodies of his children and wife Helen in sleeping bags in the ballroom. He left his mother's body in her apartment in the attic. He thoroughly cleaned the crime scene and cut out every single picture of himself in the entire house. He left behind a letter to his pastor, found on the desk in his study. In the note, John claimed that he saw too much evil in the world, and he had killed his family to save their souls. The murders were not discovered until nearly a month later. The neighbors weren't concerned due to the fact that the family was so private and barely socialized with anyone. John had sent notes to the children's schools claiming the children would be visiting their grandmother in North Carolina for a few weeks. He additionally stopped all mail and newspaper deliveries. Neighbors noticed that all of the lights in the house were continuously on day and night, with no apparent activity within them. After light bulbs began burning out one by one, they finally decided to call the police. When police arrived, they found nothing unusual on the outside of the home. However, one of the officers decided to enter the home when Patricia's drama coach showed up and convinced them something was wrong, especially after Patricia spoke about her concerns about her father being less than happy about her decision to become an actress. Police entered through an unlocked window leading to the basement, where they found the murder victims in the ballroom. The community was in shock by what had happened. Up until then, no violent crimes had been committed. The case received national attention, and a nationwide manhunt was launched. Police investigated hundreds of thousands of leads. Unfortunately, none of them were successful. In May of 1989, the Fox television program America's Most Wanted to feature John List as the most wanted fugitive during its first year on the air. The segment featured an almost perfect age-progressed clay sculpture of John List, which was sculpted by forensic artist Frank Bender. The statue turned out to look almost exactly like him. On June 1st, John List was arrested at a Richmond accounting firm after a Denver neighbor recognized him from the clay description that was featured on America's Most Wanted and alerted authorities. The FBI later discovered that after the murders, John List had traveled by train from New Jersey to Michigan and then to Colorado. In 1972, he settled in Denver and took an accounting job using the name Robert Peter Bob Clark, the name of one of his college classmates. From 1979 to 1986, he was the controller at a paper box manufacturer outside Denver. He joined a Lutheran congregation and ran a carpool for church members. At one religious gathering, he met an Army clerk named Dolores Miller and married her in 1985. In February 1988, the couple moved to Midlothian, Virginia, where List, still using the name Bob Clark, resumed work as an accountant. At trial, John List testified that his financial difficulties were too much for him in 1971 when he was laid off with the closure of the Jersey City Bank. To avoid sharing this humiliating development with his family, he spent each workday sitting at the Westfield train station, reading newspapers until it was time to come home. List schemed money from his mother's bank accounts to avoid defaulting on his mortgage. A court-appointed psychiatrist testified that John suffered from an obsessive-compulsive personality disorder and that he saw only two solutions to his situation: accept welfare or kill his family and send their souls to heaven. Welfare was an unacceptable option, he reasoned, because it would expose him and his family to ridicule and violate his authoritarian father's teachings regarding the care and protection of family members. On April 12, 1990, List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing, he denied any responsibility for his actions. He said, "I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened. I ask all affected by this for their forgiveness, understanding, and prayer." The judge was unpersuaded. John Emil List is without remorse and without honor. He said it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick and John F. List to rise from the grave. He imposed a sentence of 5 terms of life imprisonment, to be served consecutively, the maximum permissible penalty at the time. John List filed an appeal of his convictions on grounds that his judgment had been impaired by post-traumatic stress disorder due to his military service. He also argued that the letter he left behind at the crime scene, essentially his confession, was a confidential communication to his pastor and therefore inadmissible as evidence. A federal appeals court rejected both arguments. John List eventually expressed a bit of remorse for his crimes. "I wish I had never done what I did," he said. "I've regretted my action and prayed for forgiveness ever since." Thanks for watching. Please like this video and subscribe for more.